Please do.
I think, yeah, and I think the more, I don't think that's necessarily PIA, but regardless, I think we just need to be careful about showing that stuff on the screen. And certainly, like I said, I think you did that with the stuff that you guys looked at Willie's computer. So it's fine. I mean, I think there are things that don't necessarily need to be shown publicly.
Okay, we'll send you a replacement 201 if that's okay with you with that blacked out. And I'm happy to do the same on any exhibit you guys want us to do it on.
Yeah, the one that had a list of all of Willie's text messages from all time, that'd be good. That one? Every single one, please.
I don't know. Is that the Bashada exhibit?
There was a list of text messages in a spreadsheet format.
We'll find it and redact that for you.
Hey, Mr. McCabe, Kelly got kicked out. Kelly Kling-Syson, can you let her back in?
She should be coming in. The 261st District Court is back in session.
All right, I want to take up some issues related to exhibits before we finish up with the testimony. I took a look at the offered exhibits within the range of plaintiff's exhibits 310 and 402. Excuse me. I noted that exhibits 314, 387, 388, and 389 are not listed or described on the exhibit list. So even though you asked me to admit them, I'll not admit those because they are not listed or described in the exhibit list that I was provided. Similarly, well, not similarly, but also, I should say, plaintiff's exhibits 348 through 355 appear to relate to information well after the expiration of the non-compete agreement. For example, they relate to, excuse me, for example, they are entitled things like class of 2024 and so on. So
just because people
let
in the class
me
of
finish if you would, please. I promise I'll let you talk, but I would just like to finish my thought if I might, please. So I have questions about those exhibits from 348 to 355 for that reason, and I'm happy to entertain argument on both that, but also if you want to help me understand or confirm that I'm correct that the first list that I gave you really don't have corresponding exhibits listed or anywhere in the information. All right, now I'm ready, Ms. Burgess.
So first, Ms. Galvez is informing me that you are correct and those should be excluded, the ones that were not listed.
All right, so just so we're clear for the record, plaintiffs offered exhibits 314, 387, 388, and 389, which do not exist on any list, so they will not be admitted and will not be considered offered. Not offered, not admitted. All right, go ahead.
And with regard to the others, the class of 2024 is they're currently freshmen, right? Or sophomores. Anyway, it's about, you named the class from the time they're little bitty. That's how, it's their graduating year. It's not that it's.
Well, I understand that. But I understand, but when they graduate in 2024, that's after the non-compete. 2023 is going to be after the non-compete, right?
But their rankings are for now.
Who cares? Like, why do we care about that? Why is that relevant to anything?
Because that's part of Mr. Saylor's rankings that he's putting up are rankings for people who are not yet graduating.
How likely is it? How likely is it that information about somebody who's not going to graduate from high school until 2024 is at all important to anything right now?
that's what he does
4
every
years,
day.
that's 4 years from now and 5 years from the expiration, well, actually 4 years from the expiration of the non-compete. Tell me
Well,
why
Judge-
I ought to be concerned about that one.
Because
I'll tell you
every
what.
day, during the wrestling season, they are competing now and they're being ranked now. The rankings
Okay.
are current.
I tell you what, let me do it this way. In fairness to the plaintiff's claims, I'm not going to admit them now because I don't think they're relevant. However, to the extent that you can prove up their relevance in some way as it relates to the damage model, I'm happy to let you try again. But for now, 348 through 355 are not admitted. But
Perhaps I
without
should-
prejudice to you trying to prove that up with some evidence through a witness, I'm happy to hear about
And
it
Judge,
if you like.
and I can ask Mr. Piles to explain that, but when that is going to be my last area of exam for this, for my direct. And then I have Mr. Piles, while he's here, I was going to, and this would be in chambers, about the issue that we had with regard to Ray Token, where we had a separate hearing. You mentioned that you wanted to hear from him, and he's ready to talk to you about that.
I'm not interested in hearing from any witness you don't want to put on. I don't have an
No, I
interest
do
in
want to put
hearing.
him on.
I know, but you said that I want to hear from him. No offense, Mr. Piles, but it's not me that wants to hear from you. It's them who want you to tell me something. Just so we're clear, I'm not interested in any of your witnesses other than what they have to say once they've been sworn in and testify. I'm not running that train. Don't put me on it. That's all I'm trying to say. Yes, Miss Dickey.
Your Honor, we, of course, would really like to get this trial over with this week for many reasons. Spending an hour arguing about Ray Tokens and what Mr. Piles may or may not have done to violate somebody's confidentiality or whatever is something I think we can postpone right now, frankly. I'm not interested in spending a lot of time on that. It's really Mr. Soltero's issue, but I'm really interested in moving this trial along quickly and getting it concluded. So that's just.
I don't know how realistic it is to finish on Friday, given the Friday problem that I told you about this morning with regard to scheduling, but we are going to do our best to get through it. We'll take each bridge as we come to it and figure out how best to cross it. At the moment, I just wanted to get back to you on my homework assignment with regard to these exhibits, particularly if they are ones that you're going to be discussing with a witness that's currently testifying, and that I was given the impression that that would be important to do over the lunch break because some of the exhibits that have been offered and not objected to since Mr. Piles began his testimony have been discussed. And so I wanted to make sure I got that done. I'm done talking about that now. I've ruled on that. And we are now ready to go back and finish up his testimony. If we get to a subject of some interest that needs to be dealt with in the closed courtroom, not in chambers, but in the closed courtroom, we can take that up when we get there. Not there yet, so let's finish him up as best we can. Ms. Burgess, you have the floor.
Yes, Mr. Piles, why would the class of 2024 rankings be relevant today?
Because a big part of big boards and rankings are you rank the current crop of wrestlers, which would be class of 2024 are currently they're freshmen. The previous year they were 8th graders. That is a rankings big board we have done. So class of 2024, they're currently competing and getting ranked, and we're featuring freshman big board stuff on Flow. I'm sure, I don't know for a fact, but I would assume Willie is as well.
Now, do you all even on Flow Sport have junior high wrestling, junior high rankings?
Yes.
Does Flow Sports spend a lot of, does Flow Sports have other high school athletics?
Meaning other high school competitions that aren't wrestling?
Right.
Yes.
Do you have high school band?
We do.
Now, did Willie Saylor limit what he did to college wrestling?
No.
What did it include?
The scope of Willie's expertise is vast. It goes from junior high wrestling to high school to Division I to international wrestling.
As part of his work, did he follow high school wrestling?
Yes,
Some of the things that we saw earlier, like the interviews, were those with high school wrestlers?
they were.
What about the technique videos?
Steve Bozak is a graduated wrestler. It's not specifically for, it was done at a high school, but it's not specific for high school wrestling.
And when we see, for instance, Blair Academy, is that a high school or a university?
It's a high school.
And do you follow Blair Academy on Flow Wrestling?
Yeah, absolutely.
Judge, I would ask for reconsideration of admission of F348, F350, F353, and F356.
356 is already admitted, I believe.
Okay.
Is there any
Yeah,
objection?
you're right.
Judge, we object to relevance and cumulative.
Sustained. I'm not going to reconsider that ruling. I don't see. Let me clarify with Mr. Piles. Mr. Piles, what's the likelihood that those rankings will change in the next 6 months?
100%.
Exactly. Is it possible? Is it even likely that some of the people that you list, say for the class of 2024, won't even be wrestling in 2024?
No, I'm not aware of that happening. It is a
You're
possibility.
saying that every person listed on the roster as a high school wrestler today is definitely 100% going to be listed as a wrestler in 2024. You're telling me you know that with some certainty?
If they're ranked now,
That's my question. Don't kids quit sports? Don't kids break their legs? Don't kids go to live in other countries? Don't kids decide wrestling's not their thing, that maybe basketball is their thing? Don't kids decide, I think I'm going to do something other than wrestle 4 years from now? Isn't that also possible?
if you're a ranked wrestler, no, they always continue.
Okay. The ruling stands. All right.
Mr.
Let's
Piles,
move.
sure. Mr. Piles, our 2024 class rankings, are they about things that are going to happen in 2024?
No,
What are they about?
they're about it's about ranking a certain class. Like, so for example, they're the freshmen, you're putting them in order based on how well they do relative to their other class of 2024 wrestlers.
Now, is it,
Just to be clear, we all understand that, Ms. Burgess. We get that 100%. Not the point, but we understand that. There's no point in going back over that testimony.
I'm just making sure Ms. Baker's happy that I got what I need for to prove it up. So the next part, Judge, we need to go in camera. This is when I'd like to call him on the other issue.
Your Honor, if I understood if I may I be heard?
Sure.
If I understood what Ms. Burgess said earlier, is that she's telling us she wants to go into these RAID tokens issues. And I think Your Honor has been very clear that this issue isn't going to be ripe, if at all, until the damage phase. And so I think it's premature if that's what she wants to go into chambers for.
I don't want to go into chamber. We're not ever going into chambers. We are going from here into a closed session for testimony. We might go into chambers with lawyers, but we won't be taking testimony in chambers. So let's get the terminology right. The request to go into the closed courtroom to deal with the rate token issue is what's being considered. And I guess the question really is whether or not we expect Mr. Piles to be available when we get to that part of the case. There was some discussion about it already in a closed session. And so it's not that we haven't already heard it. I don't know why we wouldn't take it up now, but the answer might be because it's premature in the sense that we have decided to kind of internally bifurcate our evidence from liability issues to damage issues. And if this testimony goes to the damage issue, we could wait and do it later. So that's where we are, I think, Ms. Burgess. Is there some reason why we couldn't just call Mr. Piles back when we get to that part of the case if we do? Or
I think this is more efficient. It's not a lot of testimony. I have probably 5 questions for him.
Okay, well, let's do it. No problem. If you think it's going to be quick and easy, let's just get it done while he's here now and move on. We'll go into closed session so that we're not streaming on live on YouTube for reasons that have already been determined in this case related to trade secrets and so forth. We'll go into the session. Is there someone that should not be allowed into that closed session? Ms. Burgess.
I think you had my clients excluded, but I don't think that they are on. Katie, can you help me with that? I can't see the whole list. Okay, they're not on, so that's fine.
Very good. Then we'll go into closed session, and as soon as everyone is over there, you may proceed with your questions.
Thank you, Judge.
looks like everyone is back. And so Miss Dickey, you may proceed.
I think the witness is on mute, Your Honor.
I think they're working on it.
Mr. Powles, you testified earlier that you and Mr. Saylor have been friends for a long time. Is that correct?
Yes,
Close friends, is that right?
very.
Right. And you spent holidays together, right?
We did.
And you texted frequently every day,
Yes.
talked on the phone, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The exhibit that we've seen before, which is 198, I believe that starts on November 2nd of 2019. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And it runs all the way through sometime in January of 2020. Is that correct?
Yes,
You've had a chance to review this, I assume, recently, correct?
I have.
Okay. And it's 76 pages long, right?
Yes.
Why don't you get the document, Mr. Files?
This guy?
Well, Ms. Burgess,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear his answer. So Miss Dickey, can you ask your question?
yeah, I was just Ms. Burgess instructing him to get the document. It's in this document that the tweet that Willie Saylor put out there concerning what's going on in Columbus comes up. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that was something you were upset about, right?
Yeah, it bothered me.
Okay. And it wasn't the first time that Willie had tweeted, correct?
That was not his first tweet, no.
And it wasn't the first time he'd upset you with a tweet. Is that correct?
No, it wasn't.
Okay. And in fact, you had begged him to get off Twitter, right? You didn't really approve of him being on Twitter at all, right?
That's probably not the best characterization. I thought Twitter didn't do Willie any favors, and I thought he would make a mistake that he would regret. He often did. He called the Soriano family clown shoes, and I confronted him on that because I thought that was a
Objection,
bad
Your Honor,
idea.
non-responsive.
Sustained?
Okay. In fact, you texted him after I begged you to get off Twitter for your own sake, correct?
Correct.
So you have been begging him to get off Twitter, right?
I had asked. I thought that was would be wise for him.
Okay. And this was bad for the Flow business model, wasn't it, Mr. Piles?
It was definitely two-edged. I think Willie's personality was very helpful to Flow Sports. And
But Ray Machuca didn't think that, did he?
you should ask Ray.
Well, we have asked Ray, but you had conversations with Ray about problems with Willie, right?
Yes.
And he told you to get him under control or get rid of him, correct?
Ray instructed me to fire Willie.
On more than one occasion, correct?
Yes.
Because Willie was criticizing some of the rights holders that you had contracts with. Is that one of the reasons?
No, that is not one of the reasons.
Oh, so it was really okay, this kind of stuff, what's going on in Columbus?
I'm going to object to vague.
Sorry, hit the wrong button.
No worries. I think the objection was to vagueness. I'm going to overrule that, but in fairness to everybody, given the tech problems, I'm going to ask Ms. Dickey to re-ask her question. You're on mute. There you go.
Given my journey, I'm not even sure what the question was. So maybe we'll just move on for a little bit. So Willie Saylor, as you've testified earlier, is quite a personality, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, hard to supervise, right?
No, not in general.
Okay, easy to supervise one of your best friends?
That is a complication. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is a complication. And you and Willie were prone to disagreement, is that correct?
I don't know, prone to. We certainly had disagreements.
On a pretty regular basis, correct?
No.
Okay, well, in this 77 pages, you had many disagreements, isn't that correct? In these texts that we have in Exhibit 198, correct?
Those are from November of 2019 to January of 2020 when he did the
Yes.
market flow sport.
Well,
Yeah, that would be. But you're asking about when I managed him. So is this about when I worked with Willie or after he quit and went to Rockford?
well, sadly, you don't get to ask me questions. Let me try another one with you, okay? So your testimony is you and Willie always got along swimmingly, never had any disagreements.
That's not what I said. You asked if we were prone to. I
Okay,
said we were not. In general, we were not prone to. We did have disagreements.
okay. And sometimes it was about the tweets that Willie posted, correct?
I can think of 3 occasions where I said these tweets I think are harmful, and 2 of them he agreed and deleted them and later thanked me.
Okay, so on the night of the 2nd and morning of the 3rd, you and Willie had a disagreement, is that right? You were upset with one another, right?
Yes.
And that had happened before, right?
Yes.
And Willie had actually quit before, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, he'd quit once in the last 10 days, correct?
Correct.
But this time you took him at his word and you immediately accepted his resignation and terminated his access, correct?
Not immediately, as he was able to delete rankings, but I attempted to.
Okay. By the next day, you were making sure all of his access was cut off to Periscope and all the other funny names that y'all have for your internal access, correct? From Teams, from his email, from everything, correct?
I attempted to do that, yes.
Okay. And if you had really wanted to keep Willie, you could have talked him into staying, most likely, right? Because you've done that before.
I'm going to object. Calls for speculation.
To the extent she's asking about his expectation, he can answer that, but it's not clear from your question if that's what you're asking him. Would he have definitely? Would you have expected him to? 2 different questions.
Okay. Did you make any effort to talk Willie into staying?
Which quit are we talking about?
This quit, where you accepted his resignation and terminated his access. Did you make any attempt to talk Willie into staying?
No.
Got rid of him.
Well, he had quit 10 days prior. I didn't try to retain him then, said, okay. And then similarly here, his mind was certainly made up. And I felt like if you quit twice within 10 days, you don't want to be here. And if you don't want to be here, how helpful are you going to be? And I also had some
Objection
intuition.
Sustained.
And yet the next morning, Willie was surprised that you had cut him off of all social access, right? All access to all of this. Excuse me, can I finish my question? The next morning, you were surprised, weren't you, Mr. Piles, that Willie, let me start over. The next morning, Willie was surprised, was he not, that you had cut him off of email and off of Periscope and off of all of the other functions at Flow Sports?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
It's not clear whether he knows or not. I think that's what she's trying to ask him. So, but it's not clear from the question.
Well,
Do you know, Mr. Piles, whether or not Mr. Saylor was surprised by that action?
So I was surprised that he was surprised because the phone call
No,
left.
that's not the question. The question is, did you know Mr. Saylor was surprised by that action, by the cutting off of his access to the information?
Yeah, I think he, I'm sorry.
Did
Your
you
Honor.
know he was surprised?
Yes.
Next question, Ms. Dickey.
In fact, he was upset that he couldn't get into Gmail or Slack, and he texted you about that, right?
He did not say that he was upset about that. He said, I think, he said he didn't expect that. He didn't say he was upset.
Okay, but you knew he was upset, right?
He kind of said, I mean, pull up the text, but I think he said something like, that's not what I expected, but what's done is done kind of thing. That was kind of, so I think maybe he was disappointed, but he didn't seem, it became very obvious he was upset. But at that point in time, I don't think he had said, I am upset about this.
Well, you had pages and pages of text about it at the time, did you not, Mr. Piles, that next morning and on that day?
I don't know how much we texted that day. Yes, he eventually got very upset.
Okay. Okay, so you testified earlier that Willie Saylor is a unique personality, correct?
I did.
And that's not something that Flo invented, correct?
No.
Willie has his own brain and his own personality, and it's very distinctive. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's not something that Flo owned in any way, correct?
Obviously.
Right. And you didn't, Flo Sports didn't own Mr. Saylor's opinions, correct?
Well, I don't know how to really answer that. Obviously, his opinions moving forward, many of his opinions are still on Flow Wrestling via shows and articles. So in that way, I mean, I don't understand what you mean by own.
Well, so if there's articles and rankings on there, that's one thing, but you don't have some possessory right to Mr. Saylor going forward, right?
No.
To what he thinks, to what he says, correct?
Obviously.
That's not some persona that was funded or created in any way by Flow Sports, correct?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, well, Flow Sports is suing Mr. Saylor, correct?
Right.
And trying to keep him from doing certain things, correct?
Correct.
And we've heard a lot about spreadsheets, right?
Yes.
But Mr. Saylor's opinions, Mr. Saylor's thoughts, Mr. Saylor's criticisms, Mr. Saylor's mental processes, they belong to him. Flow Sports does not own those, correct?
I don't think so, but if it manifests itself with something that is competitive with us within the scope of the non-compete, then I would say it would. Obviously, his opinions on various things are not material to Flow, but if it would fall under the purview of work he did at Flow Sports, then perhaps it would.
So your position is that for a year after he left Flow Sports, he was not allowed to express an opinion in wrestling. Is that correct?
That's certainly not what I said.
Well, is that so? Is it correct or not?
I don't think that's correct.
Okay, so he could express opinions, correct? Because they were his, right?
Well, he was allowed to express them, yes.
Okay. When you say allowed to, you mean by this court?
I suppose I do.
Okay. But if Flow Sports had his way, he wouldn't be writing or ranking or expressing any opinions at all. Is that right?
That's not true.
Then what is your position that Mr. Saylor would be allowed to do?
In general? What do you mean?
In,
For Rockfin?
in specific, is Mr. Saylor allowed to write articles and express his opinion?
Would it be about wrestling?
Yes.
Would it be on Rockfin?
Well, let's take this one at a time. Is he allowed to express his opinions about wrestling?
Currently, yes.
No, that's not what I'm asking you. You're switching us over to what the court has allowed him to do. I'm asking what Flow Sports believes he is allowed to do. Does Flow Sports believe that for 1 year after he left Flow Sports, he was not allowed to express his opinions in the wrestling world?
I don't think that's Flow Sports' position necessarily.
Okay, so he could write and talk about his opinions. Is that correct?
In certain circumstances that were never arrived at, yeah, I think it would have been very possible.
Okay, but you just didn't want him to do that on Rockfin, correct?
That was an issue, obviously.
Right, because Martin Floriani was there, correct?
No.
Okay, well, let's talk about Mr. Floriani for a minute. You have been very vocal about this lawsuit, have you not, with other people outside of Flow Sports?
Gonna object to vague.
Well, have you expressed your opinion about this lawsuit with people outside of Flow Sports? I don't see how that's vague.
Yes.
And about,
Go ahead.
and you've expressed your opinion about factual matters and whether Mr. Floriani has taken things, is that correct?
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
Okay, have you expressed your opinion about Mr. Saylor and whether he's done things that he shouldn't do?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Yes, I have.
Okay, to many other people, correct?
No, I would not say many other people.
Well, who have you expressed it to, Mr. Piles?
I'm not entirely sure. The list is very small. Friends.
Okay, what friends?
Objection, relevance.
Well, Your Honor, he testified.
Can't have, excuse me, you can't have it both ways. You either have to tell us if it was, 5 people or 25 people or who. If you said it's a small list, then you ought to be able to name them. If you're talking about it more widely, give us that impression, but you can't have it both ways. You have to tell us something about it. So, do you know who you told? And if so, tell us who they are. If you told so many people you can't remember, tell us that. But whatever it is, tell us honestly what you've been talking about, the scope of the number of people that you've been talking about Mr. Saylor with.
I've talked about it with Ben Askren. I've talked about it. I'm trying to think of people outside of Flow, as I've primarily discussed it internally.
Is there a guy named Felters or something of that derivation? I may not have the name right.
If you get the name right, I can answer.
Okay, well, we can play that game. I'll look that up in a bit. Thank you, Mr.
Fellers, Ms. Dickey?
Pardon me?
Fellers?
Yeah, that's the name.
What's the question?
Did you talk to him about Mr. Saylor?
All right, him who?
Did you talk to Mr. Fowlers about Mr. Saylor and this lawsuit?
I've definitely talked to Fellers about Willie and perhaps the lawsuit, although I don't actually recall that.
Okay, so when Mr. Saylor left, you guys replaced him, right?
Replaced, I would say no, we didn't replace him. I think we utilized various people to fulfill his duties, yes.
Well, Mr. Lobdell, is that how you pronounce it, fulfilled some of his duties, correct?
He did some.
And he did a good job, right?
He did.
And Mr. Height did some of his duties, correct?
Yes,
And in fact, Mr. Askren came on after Mr. Saylor left and did some of the things that Mr. Saylor had been doing, right?
he did.
Okay. And Mr. Askren didn't start until after Mr. Saylor left, correct?
Correct.
So there was no information that Willie Saylor had from Flow Sports about how much money Ben Askren was making. Is that correct?
Can you ask that question again?
Sure. Mr. Askren started after Mr. Saylor left. Is that correct?
Mhm.
So Mr. Saylor wouldn't have had any Flow Sports information concerning how much money Ben Askren was making. Is that correct?
Concerning how much Ben was making, no.
Okay. So when Flo has made the allegation that Mr. Saylor tweeted out confidential information of Flow Sports, there was no possibility that he had that confidential information from Flow Sports. Isn't that correct?
That's incorrect. Willie managed people on the Flow Wrestling team. He was aware of their salary information. He compared Ben Askren's payment with their salary information.
Right. All he said was Mr. Askren is making more than you people, correct?
He wouldn't have known that had he not managed those people at Flow Sports.
Well, he could have known it through Mr. Askren, correct?
Absolutely not. He would have no idea how much they make from Ben. Ben doesn't know how much those guys make.
Do you think that those people on that team were surprised that Mr. Askren was making more than them?
Perhaps they were. I think
They were mostly just jealous that Mr. Askren was making more than them, right?
those words were not used.
Okay, so if Willie didn't get the information about how much he was making, that just wasn't confidential Flow information one way or the other, correct?
Incorrect.
Okay, we'll move on. So let's talk about replacing Willie. So Mr. Height, Mr. Sharpless, Mr. Askren, they all took a little bits of what Willie had done and did his former job, right?
Those three, among others, yes.
Okay, and they did a good job.
They did fine.
Okay, Mr. Height and Mr. Sharpless left this summer, correct?
Incorrect.
When did they leave?
Brock was a freelancer, and he did stop at some point this summer. Hunter Sharpless is still at Flow Sports. He just has a different role now.
Okay, and so who did you replace Mr. Height with?
David Bray.
Okay, and does Mr. Bray do a good job?
Does a great job.
Okay, so and are there other people out there that Flow Sports could hire to do these sorts of things? To do the things that Mr. Saylor did?
Not a lot. No one I know that doesn't work at Flow that I think could do the high school rankings, other than Brock, who is no longer here.
Okay, and is the fact that Brock is no longer there the fault of Rockfin?
I never said that.
Okay, so Mr. Saylor left and Brock Height did what Willie did, and then he left. Is that correct?
Objection. Facts not in evidence.
I think he just testified to this.
Thought I heard.
Well, it's confusing because Brock Hike did part of what he did, not all of it. It wasn't a one-for-one replacement. That's what it mischaracterizes the testimony.
Well, to the extent that he did the same thing that Mr. Saylor did, that's the part that's relevant mostly, right? So in that context, what's the answer to the question? That's the context for the question. What's the answer to that question?
You can answer.
I'm sorry. Could you ask the question again, please, Ms. Dickey?
Yeah. Okay, so Brock Height left, correct?
Correct.
He was doing a good job, correct?
Correct.
And that has nothing to do with Rockfin, correct? He didn't leave because of Rockfin, right?
No.
Okay.
No, it's a
And,
really
and
hard.
right, and you're missing Willie Saylor because you were good friends, right?
Yeah,
Okay, and he's a unique individual, right?
he is.
So is Brock Height, right?
He is.
So are you, correct? Everybody has unique skills, right?
All of us.
Okay. So one of the things that we've heard a great deal about is how much money Flow Sports invested in Mr. Saylor. Are you aware of that? That there's an allegation here that they invested that you invested lots of capital in Mr. Saylor?
Sure. Yes.
Flew him around the world, right?
Correct.
Paid for hotel rooms, correct?
Yes.
Helped him connect to coaches, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And is there any reason that you couldn't hire someone else and do this exact same thing with them? Fly them around the world, connect them to coaches, have them go to events?
Well, we could do that, but it's not like you could say, all right, post a job, welcome aboard, you're Willie. It takes years to get to that point where Willie's able to build trust in the community with these coaches. You can't just show up at a coach and instantly have trust. It takes time to develop those relationships. So
Right. There's other people that have relationships in the wrestling world. Willie isn't the only one, right?
yeah, but your question was if we would be able to immediately just have someone do that. The answer is no. It takes some time.
I think earlier you testified it was on you that you didn't get ready and didn't have someone sitting right there to replace Willie Saylor. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes.
But in fact, during the summer or earlier in the fall, Willie was leaving and going to UNC, right?
2 weeks prior to him actually quitting.
Right. So you knew he was looking, right?
Yeah, but if you're saying I should have got someone ready in 10 days, you don't understand the scope of the job.
Well, and you had known for some time that Mr. Saylor had complaints about Flow Sports, correct?
He really did not express those to me until later on, that he really didn't like the direction of Flow. And by later on, and I'm not saying that he never made an offhanded comment, but in the last 7 years, but it was only in the last month, or really that final conversation after when he told me he was quitting, where he really, I think, was honest with me about how he really felt about Flow.
Okay, and Flow had problems with Mr. Saylor, correct?
Not many.
Well, they had him on a performance improvement plan, correct?
That happens frequently, but yes, he was.
Well, you put somebody on a performance improvement plan to document their conduct in case you might need to fire them, correct?
That's not why I did it.
Why did you do it?
A personal improvement plan is to improve, to help that person and to work better with them. Willie fulfilled the duties of the PIP, and we were on the other side of it. It was 30 days. He did fine. It was kind of if you have more questions about that, but no, it was not to document so you could fire him, as evidenced by the fact that we never fired him.
But you rapidly accepted when he quit, and you did not try to talk him into staying, right, Mr. Piles?
Right, he quit twice in 10 days.
Okay. After he left, you and Mr. Saylor had many conversations about how much he was owed on his bonus. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and that information is information that has to be gotten off of Periscope, right?
It is.
And Mr. Saylor had looked at Periscope the night before he quit to get that information. Is that correct?
Objection mischaracterizes the evidence. It was after he quit.
the objection is sustained, but your testimony is not part of the record. So I'll sustain the objection because I think it mischaracterizes testimony that is in the record.
Okay, so Mr. Piles, during the course of November, you and Mr. Saylor discussed Periscope and the bonuses and the subs on many occasions. Is that right?
Yes.
And in fact, in these texts, you sent him a lot of Periscope information, didn't you?
I don't know that I did. If I did, it was only relative to his bonus.
Okay. Well, you actually sent him a screenshot, didn't you, of Periscope?
I don't think I sent him a screenshot of Periscope.
Hank, would you put up exhibit 198 for us and turn to page 48?
You have 198?
Just to be clear, we're talking about plaintiff's exhibit 198, which has already been admitted, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And I need to ask Mr. Bouchon to please bring it. We had it, but we can't find it right now.
Well, I'm going to put it on the screen, so you don't need to worry about it. Turn to page, it's Bates numbered 48, please, Hank.
I had it just a minute.
There we go. You see that? Is that right there at the bottom where it says ha ha ha? And then that chart, is that from Periscope?
That is an Excel sheet exported from Periscope of Willie's and only Willie's subscriber information.
Okay, so you were sharing the Periscope information with him more than 2 weeks after he left. Is that correct?
For the purposes of transparency.
Objection non-responsive, Your Honor.
Hey, Mr. Pyle, she's not asking why you did that, but let me remind you that Ms. Burgess has an opportunity to ask follow-up questions should she deem them appropriate and necessary. For now, just answer the question that counsel is asking you and just that question only, please. Ms.
Judge,
Dickey, you have the floor.
I have an objection to the question. The question is vague because she said the Periscope information.
I think he's already answered it, and my objection was
Excuse
not.
me. I've got it. Thank you. The objection is overruled. Next question, Ms. Dickey.
After Mr. Saylor left, a private investigator was sent to his house in Pennsylvania to collect things, microphones, a computer, or whatever that that FlowSport said belonged to them, right?
That is true.
And the computer came back to Austin, Texas, correct?
I have no idea. I am assuming that's what happened.
Did you have access to his computer?
No.
Did you look at the information that was on his computer, on his G Suite and his emails?
I looked at his G Suite after he deleted the rankings. He told me where to find those rankings in the G Suite. That would have been.
Did you go into his private email and review his private emails at any point, Mr. Piles?
No.
Okay. Ms. Burgess asked you a question about COVID-19, and there's a document on this, but I believe it's confidential. So I'm not going to put it up on the screen. But in fact, FlowSports was concerned about the financial impacts of COVID-19 on FlowSports, correct?
I would assume so.
Well, did you hear any conversations about that, Mr. Piles?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, FlowSports got millions of dollars in PPP money because of 19. Is that not correct?
Objection, relevance. This is an inappropriate question for this witness.
Your Honor, she opened up this topic.
It's not on PPP. That has a whole set of regulations around it.
Let's move on.
Okay. So at some point in your conversations with Mr. Saylor in Exhibit 198 and in person, you told Mr. Saylor that this lawsuit was not about him, that it was about Martin Floriani. Isn't that correct?
I don't know if that's exactly what I said.
Well, tell us exactly what you said. That'll be easier.
Yes. I believe I said I was trying to get him out of the lawsuit. So I felt
So,
like he,
Mr. Piles, you're giving us the why of it, not the what of it. She's asking you the what of it, not the why of it. What did you say? Not why did you say it? Just what did you say? That's all.
And
Answer
Judge,
that.
since
Yes, ma'am.
this question was based on N198, and
So
so
the
to ask-
question was, what did you tell him? That's not based on an exhibit. What did you say to him?
Okay.
Tell us that.
I basically said that because of Martin repeatedly taking Flow Sports employees and competing against us, that Flow Sports was not happy about that, and that they viewed Willie being recruited and leaving Flow Sports as kind of a last straw type of thing, and that because of Martin's previous actions, I thought Willie was going to get caught up in it. I did not want to see that happen. So that's, you're asking me to recall conversations from months ago. So I'm really doing the best I can.
Well, it's not just conversations, it's in these texts, right? Flow Sports assured you that this was not about Willie, right? That it was really about Martin.
I'm going to objection that if the document speaks for itself, and this is in the text, let's look at the text themselves. I would ask.
In this question, in this instance, Ms. Dickey, if you're asking him about what he said in 198 or what he said generally. So if you could clarify that, that would help.
Okay, let's try what you said generally.
I
Mr.
think I
Mr.
said,
Piles, did you say at any point in time to Mr. Saylor that this lawsuit was really about Martin?
I never said verbatim that, no. There would have been, it's about Martin repeatedly taking Flow Sports employees and competing against us is what I thought the lawsuit would be about.
Right. You told him they don't want to come at you, right?
Right.
Okay. And at some point, you were sharing your text with the people at Flow Sports, right? Relating to Mr. Saylor and this lawsuit.
I'm going to object. Is this a discovery question we produced in response to discovery?
No, it's not a discovery question. It's not a discovery question. It's in this.
Excuse me, I don't hear it as a discovery question. Do you have a legal objection?
Yes, I have a legal objection that it calls for attorney-client privilege communications.
Sustained. If everyone in the universe is included in the question, you'll have to narrow the scope of your question otherwise, Ms. Dickey.
Okay, well, let's go back to exhibit 198 and turn to page 82.
Again, Mr. Bouchon, if you could bring the document in, that would be great. We don't have it. We had it earlier today. It's disappeared off the table. I'm sorry, Judge.
That's okay. He's going to put it on the screen. Page 82. So at the top there, you see those two comments, right?
I do.
So you were telling Willie that this wasn't about him, right?
I don't know if that's exactly what I'm saying. I think I'm saying, ideally, they don't want to come at you. They don't want to sue you. They don't want you to compete against us.
Okay, and you say in here, they've been trying to explain to me all the ways they've tried to get you out of this, correct?
Yes.
So it really wasn't about Willie. Is that right?
I'm going to object to calls for legal communications, calls for attorney-client privilege communications.
Well, Your Honor, this is an exhibit she introduced.
Yeah, I thought the question was about his conversation with Mr. Saylor. I don't understand how that involves lawyers. So I don't understand the objection. Let me say it that way. And to the extent the question is about what he meant and when they were having this conversation, then your objection is overruled. So Ms. Dickey, what is your question for Mr. Piles?
I'm sorry. I'm old and I forget my questions. On this sheet right here, you were explaining to Willie that this really wasn't about him. Is that correct?
No, I think what I'm saying here is ideally Flow Sports would not sue Willie because he would honor his agreement to not compete against Flow Sports.
And honor his agreement, is that a phrase you made up or did you hear that from people internally at Flow?
I'm going to object. That calls for a legal conclusion. I'm sorry. It calls for attorney-client privilege communications.
Internally at Flow arguably is a vague term. I thought internally at Flow meant people who work for Flow, not people who are hired as outside counsel for Flow. But to be clear, I'll ask Ms. Dickey to rephrase her question.
Okay.
Also, Judge, I need to note that we have general counsel and a legal department inside the company, and they have privilege just like every other lawyer.
And Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Rephrase her question, and if she asks a question somebody objects to, I'll deal with that objection at the time. Ms. Dickey has the floor.
I don't want to hear what you talked about with the lawyer at Flow, okay? But were these your words that he needed to honor his agreement, or did you hear that from other employees or executives at Flow?
I have no idea if I'd heard. Are you talking about the exact words "honor his agreement"?
Yes.
Yeah, I've heard that at Flow.
Okay. And had you read his agreement?
I eventually did.
Okay. But when you were saying these to Willie in November of 2019, you hadn't read his agreement, correct?
At what point?
November of 2019, when you were texting with him.
I don't know when I first saw his non-compete and read it.
Did anyone request that you provide all your text with Mr. Saylor?
Yes.
I'm going to object.
Okay. I'm going to pass the witness.
He's answered that question already, so the objection was not timely. Mr. Soltero.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Files, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to go back to something you talked about earlier. Who's Kay Olivas?
He is he was a great young wrestler who got injured.
Right. He quit after his freshman year because he had a concussion, correct?
That sounds right.
Okay. Going back to the Columbus, Ohio State issue that led to Mr. Saylor separating from Flow Sports, you'd agree with me that his opinion was not wrong, and you essentially said that to him.
No.
Okay, let's go to Mr. Weisrod. If you could pull Defendant's Exhibit 102 that's already in evidence. And if you could, blow it up a little bit. Now, Mr. Piles, you recognize this as you making a copy of your phone, receiving a message from Mr. Jaggers and sending that to Mr. Saylor, right?
Yes.
And you're telling him that not every question needs asked nor said.
Yes.
And the reason was because this person at Ohio State was upset that he had asked what's going on in Columbus.
Yeah, he was upset. Yes.
Right. And your response there is kicking them while they're down. I mean, I'm a UT Longhorn fan. I'll tell you that there are times when we have been down. And that's
terrible. Please don't tell us about that.
okay. Sorry, Your Honor.
Instead, just ask a question of the witness, if you would, please. Let's not talk about football.
Yes, Your Honor.
Whatever other sport the UT Longhorns might be engaged in. Let's just ask them a question.
You're right. Mr. Piles, you'd agree with me at that point in time, the Ohio State program was down compared to other times when they've been better.
Well, they've won the NCAA championship, so anything short of that would technically be down. So yes.
But they were down at late October 2019 when Mr. Saylor asked the honest opinion, what's going on in Columbus, right?
They had not competed.
And did they look like they were down at the time?
They hadn't wrestled. The season starts in November.
Okay, let's take that off the screen. Or actually, I'm sorry, Mr. Weiser, if you could leave that up. Next page, please. Isn't it true that you also had to vouch for Mr. Saylor to Mr. Machuca?
I did.
Okay, and when you say that, what does that mean?
That means Ray thought on a couple occasions that I should fire Willie. And I did not think that was the best course of action. I thought, perhaps naively, that it could work out. I thought, perhaps it was one, wanting to hang on to a relationship that I knew would be ended if I fired him. And two, he still was a valuable member of the Flow Wrestling team. So, when your boss is telling you to do something, it's not that easy to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this, and try to make it work.
Okay, let's take that off the screen. Mr. Piles, there was also a problem or disagreement because of what Mr. Saylor said about Nick Soriano at Rutgers, correct?
He said that they were clown shoes, and I told him
And did that cause a similar problem that led to you complaining to Mr. Saylor about what he had expressed?
Yes.
And that was in September of 2019.
It was.
There's also an issue involving Logan Storley in March of 2019, correct?
I don't directly recall that one, but I could be. He was going after Logan Storley. I don't recall exactly.
Okay, and then was there one involving John Smith in early September of 2019?
Was there one what?
Was there a situation when Mr. Saylor made a comment about what he opined about something that was done at Oklahoma State that you reprimanded him for?
I don't know if I reprimanded him. Maybe I said, I don't remember exactly what happened with Oklahoma State. Certainly that, we, and including Willie, have great respect for Coach Smith. And I don't remember what he said or what was even in reference to, but certainly if he said something about John Smith, who'd been so great to Flow, I was like, I didn't think that was a good idea. But again, I'm kind of hypothesizing.
Mr. Piles, true or false? Willie Saylor is a very good writer.
True.
True or false? Mr. Saylor's topic selection is excellent.
True.
True or false? Mr. Saylor doesn't drive the mega numbers.
He does for high school, but that's kind of a difficult true false question.
Okay, but in terms of when he worked for you at Flow Sports in 2019, you told people at Flow that his role was not necessarily supposed to drive mega numbers, correct?
Had Willie been assigned,
Could you answer my question, yes or no? Your Honor, I object.
If you have an objection, please state it so he knows to stop talking. Mr. Piles, we've been over this. Just answer the specific question that you were asked, please. Question here was whether or not you made that statement. That's the only question on the table.
True.
Okay. And in fact, you did a performance review of your subordinate, at the time, Mr. Saylor, in 2019, where you said these things, correct?
Yes.
And one thing you didn't mention in that performance review in any way was that you had any problem or concern about how Mr. Saylor did at the NHSCA, right?
I don't know when I conducted the performance review. Do you have the date?
Let's show Defendant's Exhibit 30, please, Mr. Wisrott. You saw this recently to get ready for your testimony, right?
Yeah, yes, I have.
Okay. And so when did you fill this out as his supervisor?
It says completed in June.
Okay. Was that before or after the NHSCA?
It was after.
Okay, and is there anywhere in the performance review where you tell your colleagues at Flow
Hang on,
Sports?
before you ask him to testify about the contents of the document, it's not yet been admitted. Did you wish to offer defendant's exhibit number 30?
Yes, Your Honor, we would offer defendant's exhibit 30 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Judge.
30 is admitted. Now you can ask him about it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Piles, you fill this out as part of your job when you are reviewing people who report to you, correct?
Correct.
And you try to be honest and accurate because it's important, right?
Of course.
Did you mention anything about the NHSCA tournament in here?
No.
I'm sorry?
No.
Okay. All right, if we could go to now, in terms of how much flow, but that can, Mr. Weisert, we can take this off the screen. In terms of how much Flow actually valued Mr. Saylor, he went to Pennsylvania and actually took a demotion, right?
He demoted himself.
And you paid him less money,
Slightly less.
considerably less.
His salary was less, but he got paid a very nice bonus that got him very close to his original salary.
Okay, and when he, the year before 2019, he did not get any kind of raise, correct?
I don't recall. That could definitely be true.
And in fact, wasn't that a discussion between you and Mr. Machuca as late as October 2019 as to why it was justified to increase Mr. Saylor's bonus slightly for every 100 subs that were attributed to him?
I would say it wasn't slight, but I thought it was the best. He didn't want to, I forget the reasons why they didn't want to increase his base, but Willie wanted an increase of his subs. I believe I'm remembering this correctly. I thought he came up with a number, maybe I did, and I went to Ray and I said, hey, I think we should increase Willie's bonus structure. It'll keep him more incentivized. He's complaining to me, not complaining, but saying, hey, I would like to get a little more money. He worked really hard. I wanted it to work for Willie.
But I mean, it went up $5 a subscriber, right?
I guess that's the math. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So let's go to, and by the way, his bonus didn't kick in until he had 100 subscribers. Is that right?
No, because they carried over.
Right. You would, if he had some that were remainders, they would be applied to the next quarter. But he didn't actually hit his target until 100 subscribers under Flow system were attributed to him. True?
That is true.
Okay. And you'd agree with me that apart from Ray Machuca, there were other people at Flow Sports who had concerns about and expressed concerns to you about things Mr. Saylor had said on social media, right?
That's true.
Okay. And one of them was Adam Fenn.
True.
In fact, didn't Adam Fenn say that his biggest area of concern with Mr. Saylor was that he never posts or write anything that hurts Flow's image in the minds of those in control of the sport? Didn't he say that?
He did say that.
And Mr. Finn was, of course, the person who owned and merged his company called Wrestling Video Solutions in with Flow Sports, correct?
That is true.
In answers to some sworn questions in this case, Flow Sports answered about things having to do with what it contends Mr. Saylor's duties were, and I'd like to ask you about that. So my first question to you, sir, is in getting ready for today, have you reviewed those interrogatories?
I'm not sure of the question. Could you?
Judge,
Let me ask
I'm
you
gonna,
a better
this
question.
is, again, it's just improper out of court statements. If he wants to ask the questions, if there's something different he should ask about him, not pop quiz a non-corporate rep on discovery responses.
The question was just whether he read them or not. I don't see that as problematic. Have you reviewed them or not?
Have I read what? is my
The
question.
interrogatories that he asked you about. If you don't know what he's talking about, then that tells us some.
I don't, I'm not trying to mislead. I've read a lot. I don't know what an interrogatory is.
Now, there you go. See, that's an answer we can understand. Now, Mr. Sotero can ask you another question.
Yes. So as Mr. Saylor's supervisor, you agree that his duties diminished when he stepped down from being managing editor, correct?
Could you, what does diminished mean? What do you
Sure.
mean his duties diminished?
Sure. Let me put it this way. When Mr. Saylor went back to Pennsylvania, was he still overseeing content over track, grappling, wrestling, football, rodeo, tennis, or swimming verticals?
No, sir.
Was Mr. Saylor involved in helping shape the direction of Flow Sports' digital editorial coverage in any of those verticals that weren't wrestling?
No longer.
And was he coordinating the day-to-day and long-term editorial operations of Flow Sports content teams other than his own wrestling?
No, sir.
And okay, I want to talk briefly about the rankings issue that we've spent way too much time on. And that's sidebar, let me ask a question. Mr. Piles, when you noticed that certain rankings were no longer in a place where you and your team could find them, you confronted Mr. Saylor with them, true?
True.
And he told you where they were.
He did.
And then Flow Sports was able to post them on its website.
True.
Okay. With regards to the content creators and their compensation, was Mr. Saylor the most senior content creator in wrestling?
Mark Bader would have been more senior, but he would have been the second most senior.
Was there anything prohibiting Flow Sports employees amongst themselves from discussing what they were being paid?
Was there anything prohibiting Flow Sports employees from discussing what they are paid? No, not to my knowledge.
In fact, it's a problematic if an employer tells employees not to share salary information. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
I don't know that it's a legal conclusion that it calls for, but it does call for him to speculate it. And let's just move on.
Okay, well, Judge, I'd like to finish this line of questioning. I'll ask it slightly differently. You're not aware of whether or not the other people in wrestling shared their salary information directly with Mr. Saylor, and that's how he learned that, if he learned it, correct?
Objection calls for speculation. Very vague.
No, the question overruled. Do you know or don't you know? It's not that complicated. Do you know that or not?
I know that Willie Saylor knew how much Flow Wrestling employees made because of his time in management.
That was not his question. It just wasn't his question.
I thought it was.
Nope.
Let me try again. So he was not in management for over 18 months before he left, right?
True.
Okay. And then do you know whether or not he learned about other people's salary from them rather than from anything he may have learned 18 months earlier?
I don't know.
I don't want to get into anything about what you specifically talked about with attorneys, but it is true, is it not, that you were already working with attorneys when you were texting with Mr. Saylor? True?
Objection. The fact of legal representation itself and the content and the amount of communications is all privileged.
Except that it's already in evidence when they were when the Burgess firm was hired by Flow. So I'll overrule. Objection is overruled. Were you talking to Mr. Taylor when you were at a time when when Flow was already represented?
What time, at what point?
Which conversation are you asking him about, Mr. Saltero?
Yes, Your Honor. Well, there were a series of texts, Ms. Dickey showed some of them, in the November time period where you were, when, for instance, the private investigator came out. At that time, you already were aware that Flow Sports had legal counsel involved, right?
I don't think I knew that, no.
Okay, and when, let's pull up the plaintiff's exhibit 198.
That's 198, by the way. That 198. He's going to show it to you.
Okay, let me make sure I get to the right page. We can come back to this. All right. Your Honor, it's 2:30. I'm not sure when you were going to take an afternoon break, but I'm in between questions. If that's a good point, if not, I'll keep going.
Well, since you've stopped us, we'll stop now. We'll be in recess until 2:45.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Brett, send us in a breakout room if you would.
Okay.
Thank you so much.